Okay, so this is a trend I've wanted to talk about for a while now because we've been seeing it happen for a while now. There has been one singular theme that has bound every Total War Warhammer DLC over the last, say, year and a half, and that has been a progressively shifting scale where new units and new factions overshadow the content that has come before. Whether we're talking about campaign gameplay or competitive multiplayer, whether we're talking about the rise of the Tomb Kings or the Queen and the Crone, we've been seeing a very clear and marked shift towards more and more powerful units and more powerful mechanics. And in a lot of ways, this is a good thing, right? The evidence that CA is learning and growing and making better, more entertaining content with every new release is right in front of us. Compare The Grim and the Grave, released in September of 2016, to The Prophet and the Warlock, released in April of this year, and the disparity in quality there is staggering. Compare The Beastmen to The Tomb Kings or The Vampire Coast, and the disparity in quality there is staggering. As this trilogy has moved forward, CA have gotten way better at listening to the community and delivering content that we want, both in terms of unit selection and campaign variety. But alongside that shift in quality has been a steady dose of power creep as new units and legendary lords continue to push the boundaries further and further, higher and harder, to a point where they completely outshine anything that has come before. Now, power creep is defined as a process where new content outstrips the power of previous alternatives, leading to a game where old stuff is abandoned in favor of shiny new toys. Sound kinda familiar? And in a vacuum, I'm not sure this would even be a problem. In a perfect world where patches were rolling out every other week and new and old content was constantly getting updated, there's no real issue there. But as we know, this is not a perfect world. Creative Assembly's patching process is not a perfect system, and it's very common for us to have to wait 3, 4, sometimes even 5 months to get a patch. And in the meantime, unit performance, mechanics, and bugs can throw things severely out of whack. I want you guys to sit back for a second and recall the DLCs that have rolled out over the last few years. No question, they have gotten better and better with every new release, but starting around the rise of the Tomb Kings, we started consistently going through a cycle of release X broken or overpowered unit or mechanic, wait 2 months to patch them back to some level of normalcy, begin cycle new when new content Y is on the horizon. Tomb Kings are a prime example. In multiplayer, they were pretty busted on launch day, and the evidence comes straight from the patch notes themselves. If you recall, in the Resurgent update that dropped several months later alongside the Queen and the Crone, they got pretty massive nerfs across the board. Ark in the Black lost the heal from his Tomb Blade, which regened Hyro Titan and Warsank's Death Stars in a way that was almost impossible for a lot of factions to deal with. Constructs across the board lost 10 to 15 armor, 400 to 500 health, severe reductions in melee defense and charge bonus, and so on and so forth. They were terrors before that patch came through, and yet even after those nerfs, despite not getting any massive changes since then, the Tomb Kings are still considered one of the most competitive and well-rounded factions in Warhammer 2 multiplayer by many of the best players in the community. The Queen and the Crone was the next DLC in line, and it followed the exact same trend. Illyrio the Everqueen quickly became one of the most overpowered lords in Warhammer 2 multiplayer. Her Great Eagle had 55 melee defense to start with, completely defying the already established balance of Great Eagle mounts, Earthbloods for only 4 winds of magic, immune to psych and magic attacks in an AoE around her, and by far the best heal in the game with the Star of Avalorn, all for a relatively cheap price point considering the value she brought to bear. Hellebron had the infamous cursed blade bug that melted entire armies in seconds, and was thankfully fixed relatively quickly, but even the units themselves severely outperformed their counterparts from other factions. In particular, the Doomfire Warlocks with their 40% physical resist, poison and magical damage, incredible mobility, and bounce spells which quickly saw them rise to dominate the meta. They became the best light cav in the game bar none, for a faction who was already considered the best in the game at the time, and Sisters of Slaughter 2, crushing Ironbreakers in a frontal engagement, almost 60 melee defense on a highly mobile naked unit with a 35% missile block chance and physical resist to boot. And then the Vampire Coast came. They don't really need an introduction here. They were obscene on launch day, and even after some serious rebalancing of summons, are still one of, if not the best faction in the entire game. Whether you're talking about campaign or multiplayer is irrelevant. They single-handedly shifted the power curve of Warhammer 2. Their pirate coves were absolutely busted, allowing you to amass vast fortunes with minimal effort, trivializing the gameplay and leading to victory screens sometimes within 50 turns. Their combination of gunpowder, monsters, unbreakable chaff, and overwhelming firepower is simply too much for a lot of factions to deal with effectively. Super fun, super enjoyable, some great mechanics on display, but also a lot of additions that made the game really damn easy. And then fast forward to the Prophet and the Warlock, coming out in April of 2019, and there are once again some pretty egregious examples of power creep, not just from the units themselves, but also on the campaign side of things. Now yes, both the Skaven and Lizardmen were screaming for new content. We had to wait a very long time to see them finally get their lord back, and in keeping with the trend, CA did some of their best work ever in terms of making Ikit Claw and Tehennowin, and honestly even Tic-Tac-Toe, feel unique and engaging to play. They feel unlike any other lords who have come before, but that's part of the rub. The stuff that got added in the Prophet and the Warlock feels unlike anything that's come before. The meta has shaken out, the testing has been done, discussions have been had, and the conclusion is that a lot of these new units are severely overperforming at their current price point, especially when compared to old world units. Doomflayers are a perfect example. For some inexplicable reason, they have almost double the weapon strength of any other chariot unit in the game, almost 100 weapon strength, while most other chariots have between 50 and 55. This doesn't reflect tabletop, and they severely outperform even units like Gorby's chariots, who fill the exact same role at the exact same price point. Their animations are bananas, allowing them to dodge incoming damage relatively easily and even defeat heavy cavalry in a head-on engagement, something that chariots are not designed to do in Warhammer at all. And their small profile and tiny hitbox means that artillery and gunfire misses them frequently, which is not the case for Ithalmar chariots or Chaos chariots or Gorbis or any of those things. They all get destroyed by gunpowder fire relatively easily. The Ancient Salamander, again, another prime example. You've seen it in action on mine and Turin's channel. The sheer versatility and DPS you can unleash with that monster at its price point is absurd. It's a mobile, terror-causing hell cannon that can also grind stuff up in melee for the same price as a hell cannon. Jezzails, much the same. Incredible unit for the price, good against literally every target in Warhammer 2. They can snipe out footlords easily from long range, which is very uncommon for artillery or gunpowder units to be able to do. Can counter battery artillery, can murder cav, murder infantry, murder flyers, and murder single entity monsters, all for the low price of 900 gold. Lord Croak touches his dick and can murder entire armies with a click of a couple buttons and not even have to worry about friendly fire. And so it's not really a surprise when Lizardmen and Skaven suddenly shoot directly to the top of the meta near Vampire Coast here when they can get all these crazy new tools to play with. And that's without even getting into the Regiments of Renown. Natty Booba sharpshooters, super scary. Now, before you start freaking out, I'm not asking for CA to nerf any of the stuff or take the fun toys away. When I use an Ancient Salamander or Rattling Guns or Jezzails, when I go for a defense in-depth approach with a bunch of gun lines with the Skaven and melt stuff on the way in, that feels amazing. The endorphins be popping off, and the variety that gets added to these DLCs is exactly what makes them so appealing in the first place. I love it. But I think the problem is twofold here. For one, CA clearly erred towards the side of ridiculousness when new content drops to draw people in and get them excited. And from that standpoint, if you're into the competitive multiplayer side of things, you can absolutely argue these DLCs have pay-to-win elements. If you're playing vanilla Skaven against Prophet and Warlock Skaven, unless you severely outplay your opponent or are way more talented than they are, you are going to lose. It's just that simple. They have way better units and way more tactical options than you do. But the other side of the coin, the part that would nullify the first issue if it was somehow fixed, is that the patching process and bringing older races up to speed is painfully slow. I'm totally fine with Lizardmen and Vampire Coast and Skaven getting crazy overpowered, super entertaining toys, as long as that is the new baseline and you can reasonably bring everything else up to speed in a timely manner, both for unit performance and campaign mechanics. But the thing is, we know that's not going to happen. Now clearly, CA have been taking steps to address that issue, this ever-growing content gulf between new and old. That's why we're seeing them go back to visit old world races and try to bring them up to speed, but it's a painfully slow process. The Empire has had only one start position for 3 years. Since 2016, they have only ever been able to start in Altdorf, a minor faction the Vampire Coast, who no one ever thought would ever make it into this trilogy, has 4. The Empire's unique mechanic that allows them to appoint offices to their generals. Look at that on paper like, ooh, that's very exciting when you compare that to the Warpstone nukes and shipbuilding for the Vampire Coast. Seriously, compare Empire mechanics to Ikit Claw and the new Skaven, who can nuke your army into oblivion straight from turn 1, build obscenely powerful machines of death, and equip their gunners with incredible buffs from the Forbidden Workshop, and build undercities wherever they want. Compare the Empire to the Coast, who have a massively powerful mobile home base, who have the Galleon's Graveyard, the best start position in the game, who require no movement points to encamp, and so on and so forth. The last time we had a relatively balanced DLC on launch was Norska, back in August of 2017. I think everyone would agree their unit roster and campaign mechanics were very well received, but they also weren't glaringly OP on launch. They didn't make content that came before feel obsolete in comparison. Maybe a bit from the campaign mechanics side, but certainly not from a unit perspective. Now, how much of the power creep is intentional and designed, and how much of that is just CA getting carried away with all the new fun toys they want to bring to the battlefield, I can't really say. I think they are very much aware of the fact that overpowered units in a DLC will sell better than trash can units that no one wants to use. But I also think they're more than capable of adding DLC units that are enjoyable, strong, and usable in a variety of different matchups and roles without trivializing the campaign or dominating multiplayer. I don't think it's an either-or scenario. I think there's a middle ground to be reached, and I'm not sure we've seen it for a while. Units can be fun. They can perform their function well, they can be a blast to use, and still align relatively decently with the content that exists for the other races. That's not an argument that Jezzail should be exactly like deck gunners should be exactly like handguns. No, absolutely not. The asymmetrical balance is what makes this whole thing awesome. That's why I've had so much fun with this game for so long. Units and factions should feel different, and perform better and more cost efficiently in different areas compared to their rivals. But you can asymmetrically balance without throwing balance out the window. And I think that's been an issue over the last 4 or 5 DLCs. I think even going from Game 1 to Game 2, it's very clear that a lot of Game 2 factions, now that they have their new lords and regiments of renown, don't really have any clear-cut weaknesses, whereas quite a few Game 1 races do. If that's not power creep, I don't know what is. A legendary lord like Ikit Claw completely trivializes the campaign and overshadows basically every other lord who's come before. Not only that, he trivializes the other legendary lords of his own faction. He's way more fleshed out, way more entertaining, and way more unique than a character like Queek Headtaker. I'm completely fine with different start positions and different lords having different challenges to contend with. Not all campaigns need to be made equal. Some can be more challenging, some can be easier. Some lords can be more powerful, some can be less powerful. But I also think this is a trend that needs to be reined in just a bit, or these patches need to bring old content up to speed in a way that's much faster than has currently been happening. That frequency needs to get upped, because as an Empire player, or a Greenskins player, or a Dwarfs player, or a Beastmen player, it's gotta be very frustrating to see New World races consistently get overpowered toys and campaign mechanics and just make you feel like you've been left in the dust. So I think the major question is, do you feel like something needs to change in regards to unit balancing? Is it truly better to release new units as overpowered and godlike on launch and then nerf them later, than to just have them be good and usable but still relatively balanced from day one? How much of that is intentional, and how much of that is just a byproduct of the fact that Creative Assembly is introducing new mechanics and new toys and just want them to be fun for the players? What are the best ways to address this going forward? I think there's one clear-cut way, that's to invest more resources into the trilogy. Don't leave a skeleton crew working on the game in isolation. Get more people on it, and patches and content are going to come out much faster. We've been told that adding more people to a project doesn't necessarily speed up the process, and while that's true at a certain point, that is not true when there's only a skeleton crew working on balancing and implementing campaign mechanics in the first place. When you have a tiny team working on the game, which I think it's very clear at this point that's how it's working out, then it's obviously going to be a long time before releases. And when you're waiting 3 or 4 or 5 months for patches that fix game-breaking bugs or serious balance issues, that is a problem, and it's going to hurt player retention as well. I'm personally of the mind that in terms of unit balance, there is already a very good blueprint for how units should look and function in Warhammer 2. It's fine to go outside that blueprint and make a unit crazy good in one way, but if that's what you're gonna do, it has to have clear-cut weaknesses in other ways. And units like Doomflayers break that mold kind of out of left field, because that's not how they function in the tabletop. They weren't completely different than any other unit in the game. They still played by mostly the same rules. Being able to mulch heavy cav, mulch infantry, avoid gunfire, and avoid a lot of the traditional counters that similar units with similar price points experience is kind of strange. I get that people love the power fantasy element, and frankly, so do I. There are times where I just want to jump into a campaign and destroy stuff, and a faction leader like Ikit Claw brings that in spades. But when a handful of factions are getting all the overpowered toys, and others are kind of left crying in the corner, that feels weird, and honestly, it leaves the game feeling very top-heavy. And the more stuff gets added that completely shifts the power curve away from the races of old, the worse it's gonna get until we reach a point where Old World and New World don't even feel like the same game anymore. And that doesn't make any sense. That's not how things should look in a game like Mortal Empires, which is a promise of a world-spanning campaign that is interconnected with every race in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. So let me know, do you feel like these DLCs have introduced a noticeable power creep? Do you feel like that is a bad or good thing for the game? It could be either. And how do you feel like CA should address it, if they should address it? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below, and I'll see you all in the next video. Any Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.